Johnny Cash was standing in the hallway backstage at the Sands Hotel in Las Vegas when he heard Dean Martin's voice coming from the dressing room. The door was closed, but Dean's voice carried. It always did. That smooth, easy voice that had charmed millions. Except right now, it didn't sound charming. It sounded strained. It was 1970. Dean was headlining at the Sands, his usual residency. Big crowds, sold-out shows, the kind of Vegas spectacle Dean Martin had perfected over years of performing. Cash had been invited as a guest, not to perform, just to watch the show from the audience, maybe come backstage afterward, a professional courtesy between two giants of American music. But now, Cash stood in that hallway, listening to Dean's voice through the closed door, and something was clearly wrong. "I can't do it," Dean was saying. "Not with him here." Cash couldn't hear who Dean was talking to, but he heard the response, a lower voice, probably the show's producer or Dean's manager, calmer, trying to reason. Then Dean's voice again, louder now. "Either he leaves or I don't go on. That's it. That's the choice." Cash stood very still. He knew, without needing to hear more, that Dean was talking about him. The door opened suddenly. A man in a suit, the producer, stepped out and nearly ran into Cash. He looked startled, then uncomfortable. Behind him, through the open door, Cash could see Dean Martin sitting in front of his dressing room mirror, still in his street clothes, his bow tie hanging loose around his neck. "John," the producer said, his voice tight. "Can we talk?" Cash nodded. They walked a few steps down the hallway, away from the dressing room door. "Listen," the producer said, keeping his voice low. "We have a situation." "I heard," Cash said quietly. The producer looked relieved that he didn't have to explain. He's having a moment. He's asking, he's insisting that you leave before the show starts." Cash didn't respond right away. He just looked at the producer, waiting for more. "I don't know what's going on," the producer continued. "This has never happened before, but the show starts in 20 minutes, and Dean says he won't go on if you're in the building." Cash looked down the hallway toward Dean's dressing room. Through the open door, he could see Dean's reflection in the mirror. Dean was staring at himself, his hands gripping the edge of the makeup table. "Did he say why?" Cash asked. The producer hesitated. He said you make him feel like a fraud." Cash's expression didn't change. He just nodded slowly, as if this confirmed something he'd already suspected. "John, I'm sorry. This is unprofessional. It's wrong. But I have a theater full of people waiting for Dean Martin to perform, and if he doesn't go on, we're in serious trouble." "I understand," Cash said simply. "You do?" "Yes." The producer looked surprised. "So you'll leave?" Cash looked toward Dean's dressing room one more time. Then he looked back at the producer. "Tell Dean I'm leaving, and tell him I hope he has a good show." The producer blinked. "That's it? You're not going to talk to him?" Cash shook his head. "No, he doesn't want to talk to me. He wants me gone. So I'm going." "John, you don't have to." "I know," Cash interrupted gently, "but I'm going to anyway." And with that, Johnny Cash turned and walked down the hallway, through the backstage area and out into the Las Vegas night. He didn't stop to talk to anyone, didn't make a scene, just left. The producer stood there for a moment, not quite believing what had just happened. Then he went back to Dean's dressing room. Dean looked up when the door opened. "Did he leave?" "He's leaving now," the producer said. Dean closed his eyes. "Good. Okay, good." "Dean, what the hell was that about?" Dean opened his eyes and looked at his reflection in the mirror. "I can't explain it." "Try." Dean was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "When Johnny Cash is in a room, everything changes. The energy, the attention, the weight of everything. He doesn't try to do it. He just is. And when I'm around him, I feel like everyone can see what I really am." "Which is what?" "A performer," Dean said. "An act. A guy who tells jokes and sings songs and makes people feel good for an hour. That's all I am. But Cash Cash is real. What he does, who he is, it's not an act. It's not a performance. It's just him. And when we're in the same room, everyone can see the difference. And I can't perform knowing that people are comparing us. The producer didn't know what to say, so he said the only thing he could think of. The show starts in 15 minutes. Dean nodded. I'll be ready. And he was. Dean Martin went on stage that night and performed exactly the way he always did. Smooth, charming, making it all look easy. The audience loved it. They laughed at his jokes. They applauded his songs. They left the theater happy. But backstage, after the show, Dean sat alone in his dressing room for a long time. He'd gotten what he wanted. Cash was gone. The show had gone smoothly. But now he had to live with what he'd done. Johnny Cash went back to his hotel room. June was there, waiting for him. "You're back early," she said, looking up from the book she was reading. "I thought you were going to Dean's show." "Change of plans," Cash said. He took off his jacket and sat down on the edge of the bed. June studied his face. She'd been with Cash long enough to read his moods. What happened? Cash told her about standing in the hallway, about Dean's ultimatum, about leaving without confrontation. June was quiet when he finished. Then she said, "How do you feel about it?" Cash thought about it. "I don't know. Part of me understands. Part of me is hurt. But mostly I just feel sad for Dean." "Why?" "Because he's one of the most talented entertainers in the world. And he thinks he's a fraud. That's a hard thing to carry." June reached over and took his hand. "You know you're not the reason he feels that way, right?" "I know, but I didn't help. Just by being there, I made it worse." They sat in silence for a moment. Then June said, "Are you going to talk to him?" Cash shook his head. "No, he doesn't want to talk to me. And honestly, I don't know what I'd say. What he's feeling, it's not about me. It's about him. And he has to work that out on his own." The story of what happened that night spread through Las Vegas entertainment circles within days. Different versions emerged. Some people said Dean and Cash had a fight. Others claimed Cash stormed out in anger. A few suggested the whole thing was staged for publicity. But the people who were actually there knew the truth. Dean Martin had refused to perform unless Johnny Cash left. And Cash had quietly left without argument. Most people thought Cash had been disrespected, that Dean had been unprofessional, that Cash should have stood his ground. But a few people understood what Cash had understood in that moment. That Dean wasn't being malicious. He was being vulnerable. And sometimes the kindest thing you can do when someone is that vulnerable is to give them what they need, even if it seems unreasonable. Dean Martin and Johnny Cash never talked about that night. Not to each other, not publicly. It became one of those moments that everyone knew about, but nobody discussed directly. They saw each other occasionally over the years, at industry events, award shows. They were polite, professional, but there was a distance that hadn't been there before. Years later, in the early 1990s, Dean Martin was doing a rare interview. He was older now, mostly retired. The interviewer asked him about regrets, about moments in his career he wished he could take back. Dean was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "There was a night in Vegas. I was performing at the Sands, and I asked someone to leave, someone who'd been invited as my guest. I made them leave because I was insecure, because I felt threatened by their presence." The interviewer leaned forward. "Who was it?" Dean shook his head. "It doesn't matter who. What matters is why. I felt like this person was more real than I was, like their authenticity made my performance look fake, and instead of dealing with my own insecurity, I pushed them away." "Did you ever apologize?" "No," Dean said quietly. "I should have, but I didn't. And that's something I have to live with." "Why didn't you?" Dean looked down at his hands. "Pride, mostly. and shame. How do you apologize for something like that? How do you say, "I'm sorry I made you leave because your existence made me feel like a fraud"? There's no good way to say that. Do you think they understood? Dean smiled slightly, a sad smile. Yeah, I think they did, which somehow makes it worse, because they had the grace to understand what I couldn't even explain to myself. He paused, looking out the window. You know what the worst part is? That night, after the show, I sat in my dressing room and I knew I'd made a mistake. Not because the show went badly, it went great, but because I'd proven to myself exactly what I was afraid of. That I needed the performance more than I needed the truth. That I'd rather push away someone real than risk people seeing through me. And from that moment on, every time I stepped on stage, I thought about it. Every joke I told, every song I sang, I wondered if this was what I'd traded authenticity for. A room full of applause from people who didn't know who I really was. The interview continued, but that moment stood out. Because Dean Martin, who'd spent his entire career making everything look easy, was admitting that sometimes things weren't easy at all. That behind the charm and the jokes and the smooth performances, there was a person who struggled with the same doubts and insecurities as everyone else. Johnny Cash died in 2003. Dean Martin had already passed away in 1995. Neither man ever publicly reconciled what happened that night at the Sands. But people who knew them both said that Cash never held a grudge, that he understood Dean's struggle, that he saw it not as a personal rejection, but as a moment of human vulnerability. And people who knew Dean said that night haunted him for the rest of his life. Not because Cash had been angry, but because Cash had been understanding. And somehow that understanding was harder to live with than anger would have been. Because when someone shows you grace in your worst moment, you can't escape what you did. You have to carry it with you. The night Dean Martin refused to perform unless Johnny Cash left the building became one of those legendary moments in entertainment history. But the real story wasn't about ego or rivalry or professional jealousy. It was about the difference between performing and being, about what it costs to maintain an image, about the exhaustion of always being on. Dean Martin was Dean Martin 24 hours a day. He couldn't turn it off, couldn't let the mask slip, couldn't allow himself to just be a person instead of a persona. Johnny Cash was just Johnny Cash. No mask, no performance. Just a man trying to live his truth with all the messiness and complications that came with it. And when those two approaches to life existed in the same room, something had to give. Dean chose to preserve his performance. Cash chose to honor Dean's need to do that. Neither choice was wrong. Both choices came with a cost. Dean got to perform that night, but he lost something in the process. A friendship, maybe, or just the possibility of one. And more than that, he lost the chance to drop the mask, to let someone see him struggle, to admit that the performance was exhausting. Cash left that night, but he didn't lose anything, because he'd already made peace with who he was. He didn't need to perform authenticity. He just lived it. And in the end, that was what Dean couldn't stand. Not that Cash was more talented, not that Cash was more famous, but that Cash had figured out how to exist without the constant performance that Dean had built his entire life around. Some people shine on stage. Some people change the light in a room just by walking into it. Dean Martin was the former. Johnny Cash was the latter. And on a night in Las Vegas in 1970, those two types of presence couldn't coexist. So Cash left, quietly, without anger, with understanding. And Dean performed, beautifully, professionally, while carrying the weight of knowing what he'd asked someone to do.
That's what happened the night Dean Martin refused to go on stage unless Johnny Cash left the building. It wasn't a fight. It wasn't a rivalry. It was just two men trying to exist in their own ways and discovering that sometimes those ways are incompatible. And the shocking part, the part that nobody expected, wasn't that Dean made the demand. It was that Cash understood why and left without argument. Because that's what real grace looks like. Not fighting back, not defending yourself, just recognizing that someone else is struggling and giving them the space they need to survive, even when it means you have to leave.